Thank you. It's great to be here. So I want to start with this handsome gentleman. This is Konrad Underdahl. He is the son of Norwegian immigrants. He grew up on a farm with his 10 siblings in Idaho. And in 1940, like many of his peers, he joined the military, joined the army. This is Konrad a few years later receiving the Silver Star for valor in combat. And that medal hung alongside his Purple Heart proudly on his chest. Now, this is a picture of Konrad years later. Years later, long after he had transitioned out of the military, he served as the principal of a high school at a vocational school in Alexandria, Virginia. He said to the rest of the world, he said to his community, I served in combat, but I'm not done. I'm going to serve back here at home. That was a message that crossed generations in terms of his legacy. Now, this is a picture of my grandfather, along with my grandmother, many years later. We didn't see a picture of my grandmother earlier, but she, in 1944, joined the newly formed Marine Corps Women's Reserve. She was a Corsair aircraft maintainer, and she ultimately attained the rank of sergeant as a Marine. And she and my grandfather had unique stories. Their individual stories were unique, yet their general experience was shared by nearly 20 million Americans. 20 million Americans in World War II stepped up to fight in the wake of a real danger. They stepped up and they shared this experience in the military. And in doing so, they started a legacy. They communicated a legacy to others. And their country largely understood why they did what they did. And when they returned home, they held them in high regard. They were very highly regarded. They were highly resourced. And they were generally understood by their communities around them. So they came home and they began to define a legacy. My grandfather served, again, as a high school principal. But other veterans went on to build the interstate highway system. They launched rockets into space. They became municipal leaders. They became state government leaders. They led in the federal government. We had 3 presidents who served after World War II had been in the military. They defined a legacy. And in this case, my grandparents' legacy was even more individual, and it crossed generations. Their service, both in war, in the military, and their service after, was ultimately an inspiration for my own service. So my grandparents, over the last few years, have both passed away, and their passing got me to start thinking about legacy. Not only their legacy, but also the legacy of this generation of veterans. What is the legacy of this generation of veterans going to be? What is this legacy going to be? In the last 12 years, nearly 2.5 million Americans, men and women, have served in direct support of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a big number, but it still represents less than 1% of our adult population. So are they going to be returning to the same resources and level of understanding that my grandparents' generation returned to? Will your kids and grandkids hold them in the same regard by which I hold my grandparents? You know, we're on the threshold of a time when we're going to be answering those questions and determining the legacy of this generation of veterans. And as we stand on that threshold, I see 3 possible legacies unfolding. The first is that today's generation, today's veterans could be the generation that ushered in a whole new era of warfare. Counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, IEDs, drones, special operations warfare, warfare with the CIA involved, a whole new era of warfare. Or they could be the generation that ushered in a whole new era of veterans' challenges. Challenges that you've already heard about this afternoon. Challenges like unemployment and high suicide rates and post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury and moral injury, prosthesis, amputations, all these things that you see in the mainstream press. That could be their legacy. Or still, their legacy might be that they are the forgotten generation. Due to their numbers, less than 1% of the adult population, they may slide back into our communities with little fanfare and little legacy for future generations. Now, this guy, George Washington, did a little thinking about legacy over 200 years ago. And in particular, he did some thinking about what society's role in determining the legacy of veterans should be. This is what he said: "The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive the veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation." So General Washington knew that how we treat veterans today will actually help determine the security and the safety of our country many generations to come. And that's where we stand today. We're on the threshold of that kind of impact. So at the Mission Continues, we have a fundamental belief in how we treat and appreciate the veterans of this generation. We also believe that there's a different legacy. There's the potential for a completely different legacy than the three that I just outlined. This generation was an all-volunteer force who was ready to come back and serve. So we empower veterans to serve their country in new ways. We recognize that they're not coming home looking for a handout, for free baseball tickets, for discounts at theme parks, for gift baskets. They're not looking for handouts. What they're looking for is an opportunity to find what they found in the military: hard, meaningful work and a sense of purpose. We also offer them the opportunity to join a new team, have the same kind of identity and esprit de corps and camaraderie that they found in the military, and build connections in their community. So we do this we have two core programs. Our first program is our fellowship program. And in our fellowship program, we focus on the individual veteran, and we say to him or her, we want you to serve in your community in an intense community service program over 6 months. You're going to work on community issues right across the spectrum of community issues, whether it's youth development or serving the homeless or protecting the environment, across the entire issue spectrum, serving at organizations large and small, like Habitat for Humanity or the American Red Cross or Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And you're going to commit to deploy your skills and your experiences in your community over that 6 months. And while you do, you're going to be working on your own transitions home, and you're going to be defining the legacy of your generation of veterans. So this is April Jones. April Jones is a Mission Continues fellow. She was born and raised in Chicago. She followed her childhood dream into the Army, wanted to serve her country. She enlisted as a signal support specialist. She deployed to Afghanistan, and there she ran phone lines, she set up communications networks, she built satellite antenna. And when she redeployed home and transitioned out of the military, she faced many of the same struggles that we've talked about this afternoon. She felt isolated, she felt disconnected from a team, she didn't have a sense of purpose, and she found the Mission Continues. And we invited her, we challenged her to go into service in Nashville, Tennessee, at a center for immigrant and refugee youth. There, she worked with immigrants and refugees on their English skills. She brought up their classroom performance. And while she was improving the performance of this classroom of kids who needed to transition into a new country, she was working on her own transition home. And she was demonstrating to that entire classroom that the legacy of this generation of veterans can be one of service, both in war and back home. So the second program we have at the Mission Continues is our Service Platoon program. Whereas our fellowship program invites individual veterans into service in individual organizations in their community, our Service Platoon program invites teams of veterans to band together in new units, new platoons in their community and tackle pressing issues collectively and bring collective impact into the community. And while they do that, here's what you see. You see the peer-to-peer support networks that you see in military units. You see the esprit de corps, you see the camaraderie. So we're replicating that in communities all across the country. Now what these two programs combined to do is create a new call to action for veterans. And this call to action is to report for duty again in your community. So that call to action has gone out through the Mission Continues, but here at the feast this week, what you can do is help build a platform that will enable veterans to answer this new call to action. And what's important about this platform is that it should not only bring benefits and resources and opportunities to veterans, but this platform should invite and encourage and draw out veterans to be active and productive and valuable members of their community. Because ultimately, as George Washington told us, and as my grandparents told us, it's our shared responsibility as citizens to ensure that the newest generation of veterans is demonstrating to the youngest generation of Americans that their legacy will be one of action and service. So thank you for picking up this challenge this week here at the feast and joining us in this great work.